cloning mechanism. But if you actually look at a flowering plant, what scientists call angiosperms, that illusion of simplicity is just entirely shattered.
Yeah, it's a really common misconception. I mean, assuming plants operate on this.
So if you chop a piece off a standard kitchen sponge, you just get two sponges, right?
Right, yeah.
And I think for a long time, it's been incredibly easy to look at, say, the plant sitting cloning mechanism. But if you actually look at a flowering plant, what scientists call angiosperms, that illusion of simplicity is just entirely shattered.
Yeah, it's a really common misconception. I mean, assuming plants operate on this lower tier of complexity just because they don't walk around.
Right.
But relying purely on that sponge method, the vegetative cloning you just mentioned, is actually a massive evolutionary liability.
Which perfectly brings us to today's deep dive. We are pulling from a really comprehensive biology lecture that breaks down the sexual reproduction of flowering plants. And our mission today for you listening is to decode what is essentially a secret life happening right in front of you.
It really is a secret life.
It is. We are going to explore how plants engineer these incredibly complex reproductive factories, how they draft like wind and ocean currents and even animal mercenaries into these elaborate transport networks.
Oh, the mercenaries are fascinating.
We'll definitely get to them. And we'll look at how they execute this bizarre biological maneuver called double fertilization. And all of this orchestrated chaos is just to create the simple fruit or seed you might be, snacking on right now.
Well, to understand the how of all that chaos, we really first have to understand the why.
Right, like why bother?
Exactly. Why go through this immense effort when cloning is just so much easier? And the answer is genetic variation.
Okay.
Because if a plant just clones itself endlessly, you end up with an entire field of genetically identical copies. And while that's fast, it's highly, highly dangerous.
Because they share all the same weaknesses.
Right. One single new virus, or say a sudden drop in temperature, and it can wipe out the entire population because nobody possesses a genetic advantage. So sexual reproduction is basically the plant kingdom's ultimate insurance policy against extinction. It shuffles the genetic deck every single generation.
So to shuffle that deck, they have to build a factory. I mean, before you can have reproduction, you need the physical infrastructure to make it happen.
I do.
And the source material calls the flower a, quote, morphological and embryological marvel, which honestly seems like incredibly high praise for something we mostly just use to decorate a dining room table.
Yeah, but botanists and agricultural scientists, they don't use that phrase lightly. The architecture of a flower is a literal masterpiece of biological engineering.
Okay, so how does it work?
Well, to map it out, scientists often break the flower down into 4 main whorls, or like concentric layers moving from the outside in. We can trace this using the letters K, C, A, and G.
Okay, let's walk through that blueprint. K, C, A, G.
Right, so starting on the very outside, K represents the calyx. This is made up of the sepals, those little green leaf-like flaps at the base of the flower.
Oh yeah, underneath the petals.
Exactly. And their job is purely defensive, just protecting the flower when it's still a vulnerable bud. Then, moving one layer in, we hit C for the corolla. This is the collection of petals, the bright, vibrant, colorful part.
Okay, I'm going to pause you right there because I'm looking at this from an energy expenditure standpoint.
Okay.
Creating those massive, bright petals takes a lot of nutrients. But if the end goal is strictly reproduction, the petals and those green sepals at the base, they don't actually manufacture any genetic material, right?
No, they don't. In botanical terms, the calyx and corolla are classified strictly as accessory parts. They are completely non-essential for the actual fusion of gametes.
Wait, so the plant is pouring all this energy into them for what, just to put on a show?
Essentially, yes. Their entire existence is a targeted advertising campaign.
Right.
Yeah, they function purely as billboards and landing pads to catch the eye of a passing pollinator. They exist to signal, hey, we have food here. All the essential magic, like the actual generation of life, happens exclusively in the inner 2 layers.
Okay, the A and the G.
Right. That brings us to A, the androecium, which is the male reproductive part made of stamens. And finally, sitting right in the very center of the flower is G, the gynoecium, which is the female part, sometimes called the pistil or carpel.
Wow. Okay, so now that the architecture makes sense, let's look at what's actually being manufactured inside those inner layers. Because the plant needs to create its workforce, right? The male and female gametes.
Exactly.
Let's start with the male side, inside the anther. The plant is mass-producing pollen, but it coats each individual grain in this chemical called sporopollenin. It forms the outer shell, known as the exene, and the properties of this chemical are frankly hard to believe. It's basically a microscopic adamantium spacesuit.
It really is. I mean, spore pollen is widely considered one of the most resistant organic materials ever discovered in nature.
That's insane.
It's completely unfazed by extreme high temperatures. You can expose it to strong acids or harsh alkalis, and it just remains perfectly intact. Biologists have yet to find a single biological enzyme capable of degrading it.
The lecture notes that this indestructible quality is exactly why we can find perfectly preserved pollen in the fossil record from thousands and thousands of years ago. Like, it survives everything.
Yeah, it does.
But I guess you have to wear a heavy-duty suit if you're about to be, launched into the atmosphere.
Precisely. That pollen grain has a perilous journey ahead. It's going to face UV radiation, extreme heat, severe dehydration. But the armor is really only half the story.
Right. What's inside?
Exactly. What matters is the payload inside. When a pollen grain is fully mature, it contains two distinct cells.
Yeah.
You have a massive vegetative cell, which is densely packed with food reserves, and this thick jelly-like fluid called cytoplasm.
Okay.
And floating within that massive cell is a second, much smaller cell called the generative cell.
Yeah, the source material has a great visual for this. It says the generative cell just floats around inside the vegetative cell's jelly like a tiny boat bobbing in a vast sea. The big sea is basically just there to keep the little boat alive.
And that tiny boat carries the crucial genetic payload. It will eventually divide to become the male gametes. But to understand where that boat is going, we have to look at the female side of the equation.
Right.
It's a process called megasporogenesis happening deep inside the ovule.
And it seems like the male strategy is all about mass production, right? Billions of adamantium spacesuits.
Yeah.
But the female strategy is the complete opposite. It operates with a ruthless, almost brutal efficiency.
It is incredibly highly selective. Deep inside the ovule, the plant selects a single cell to be the megaspore mother cell. It undergoes a division to create 4 megaspores. Now, these are haploid cells, meaning they each carry only half of the plant's genetic blueprint, so they desperately need a partner to complete the set.
Okay, so it makes 4.
Right, but the plant doesn't keep all 4. It immediately aborts 3 of them.
Wait, it just destroys 3/4 of its own creation right out of the gate.
Yes, only 1 survives. Botanists call this monosporic development. The plant channels all its available resources into this one functional megaspore.
That is brutal.
It is. And what that lone survivor develops into is incredibly complex. It becomes the embryo sac. Through a series of rapid divisions where only the nucleus splits without building cell walls right away, it creates this bizarre structure. It ultimately ends up with 8 distinct nuclei, but only 7 cells.
Okay, wait, let me do the math on that. 8 nuclei, but only 7 cells. That means somebody is doubling up.
Exactly. The massive cell right in the center of the embryo sac keeps 2 nuclei for itself. We call those the polar nuclei. They just float there in the middle, kind of holding down the fort.
Right.
But the critical part of the structure is located at the entrance, called the micropilar end. This is where the actual female egg cell sits, and it's flanked by 2 helper cells known as synergids.
And those helper cells, the synergids, are equipped with something the source highlights as the filiform apparatus.
Yes, the filiform apparatus is essentially a chemical siren. Think of it as a landing beacon.
Because the pollen tube, whenever it finally arrives, is basically flying blind, right? It's tunneling down through dense plant tissue.
Yeah.
And it needs to know exactly where the egg is hidden.
It is completely tunneling blind. So the filiform apparatus releases a chemical gradient. As the pollen tube gets closer, the chemical signal gets stronger and stronger, basically screaming out, "Navigate this way! The egg is right here!"
Wow.
It guides the incoming male gametes perfectly to the entrance.
Okay, so we have our male gametes locked in their protective armor, and we have our ruthlessly selected female gamete waiting quietly by the chemical beacon. But here is the gaping hole in this entire operation.
Oh, yes.
Both of these gametes are entirely non-modal. They have no legs, no wings, no tails. They cannot walk or swim to each other. So how do they bridge the gap?
This is where we see the evolutionary shift from internal biology to external ecology. The plant must recruit delivery agents, and they rely on 3 primary strategies: wind, water, and animals. Each strategy carries severe evolutionary trade-offs, though. Let's look at the physical forces first. Wind pollination or anemophily.
The text gives a perfectly relatable example for wind pollination. Corn on the cob.
Oh, yeah.
Because everyone knows the feeling of shucking a fresh ear of corn and fighting with those annoying silky threads get stuck in your teeth. Those threads, the tassels, are actually incredibly long, feathery stigmas. They literally just hang out in the air, waving around in the wind, desperately trying to catch microscopic, non-sticky pollen that might randomly drift by.
Which perfectly illustrates the statistical nightmare of wind pollination. I mean, the plant has to expend massive amounts of energy to produce astronomical quantities of pollen because the vast majority of it will never hit a target. Wind doesn't care about the plant's reproduction. It is a game of pure statistical luck.
So if wind is a blind numbers game, you would assume plants that live in the water have it figured out. Just drop the pollen in the water and let the currents do the work. But water pollination hydrophily is shockingly rare.
It is remarkably rare. You might assume aquatic plants would naturally utilize the water. But many of them, like the water lily or the water hyacinth, they completely betray their own environment.
How so?
They grow their flowers up on stalks, pushing them out of the water entirely just so they can utilize wind or insects instead.
That's crazy. They evolved in a liquid medium and still decided, nope, the ocean is too unreliable, we're outsourcing to the air.
Right.
But for the few that do use water, the mechanics are fascinating. The source mentions two very different approaches. There's Vallisneria, which releases its female flowers to the surface, and the male flowers detach and float up like tiny little plastic balls. They just bob along the surface tension, hoping to bump into a female.
And a completely different approach is taken by Zostera, which is a marine seagrass. It doesn't bother with the surface at all. It executes its entire pollination cycle entirely submerged underwater.
How does that even work?
Well, to achieve this, its pollen grains aren't round. They are long and ribbon-like. This specific shape gives them neutral buoyancy, allowing them to drift perfectly suspended within the water column until they drape across a submerged female flower.
That is so cool. But still, relying on passive weather or ocean currents is a gamble. Neither the wind nor the water is trying to help the plant. So some plants stopped relying on passive forces and started actively manipulating the local wildlife.
Yes, zoowaza.
Animal pollination. This is basically the biological gig economy. The plant pays an insect or a bird in exchange for highly targeted delivery services. They offer nectar, which is basically a sugary energy drink, or edible pollen, or in some cases, safe shelter.
It is a purely transactional relationship. The animal arrives seeking a reward, gets dusted with pollen, and delivers it to the next flower. The plant gets a highly reliable courier service that flies directly from target to target.
And the length they go to for this transaction are staggering. The amorphous flower grows 6 feet tall.
Yeah, it's massive.
It builds a literal skyscraper just to offer a giant safe sanctuary for insects to come and lay their eggs.
Yeah.
And in the process of moving in, the insects inadvertently do all the pollinating.
Yeah.
But the most extreme example of this gig economy is the relationship between the yucca plant and the pronuba moth.
That is a textbook case of coevolution. They have entered into a lifelong exclusive biological pact. The moth uses the plant's ovary as a safe incubator to lay its eggs, ensuring its larvae will have a food source. But the moth doesn't just passively bump into pollen. It purposefully and actively gathers the pollen and physically packs it onto the plant's stigma. They are now so deeply dependent on each other that neither species can complete its life cycle alone. If that specific moth goes extinct, the yucca plant goes extinct with it.
It's an incredible partnership.
Yeah.
But I have to ask the obvious question here. If getting this pollen from point A to point B requires building adamantium suits, surviving the open ocean, or bribing a moth, well, why not just take the easy way out? Like if a flower has both male and female parts sitting right next to each other, why not just self-pollinate?
Because we cycle right back to the danger we discussed at the start, evolutionary stagnation.
The cloning issue.
Exactly. If a plant continually self-pollinates, it triggers a phenomenon known as inbreeding depression. The offspring become genetically weak, harmful recessive mutations begin to compound, and the plant loses its ability to adapt. If the environment shifts, a lineage that only self-pollinates will simply die out.
But there are a few desperate exceptions to this rule, right? The source mentions cleistogamous flowers like the viola or cumelina.
Yes, those are the outliers. Cleistogamous flowers are secretive, closed buds that never open. Their petals remain permanently shut, locking the male and female organs inside a tiny vault together. They really have no choice but to self-pollinate.
Which seems completely counterintuitive to the entire goal of genetic variation.
It is a drastic trade-off. It guarantees long-term genetic weakness, yes, but it is a flawless way to absolutely guarantee short-term reproduction. If that plant lives in an environment where pollinators have disappeared, or the weather is too extreme for flowers to open, a cleistogamous flower ensures it will at least produce seeds to survive the season.
Right. A desperate times call for desperate measures situation. But for the vast majority of plants, self-pollination is the enemy. They desperately want cross-pollination. So they've engineered these internal defense systems, known as outbreeding devices, to actively fight off their own pollen.
Yes, they have several tricks.
Some alter their timing, a tactic called asynchrony. The plant will release its pollen on Tuesday, but its female parts won't become receptive until Friday. By then, its own pollen is blown away. Other plants, like the papaya, just remove the option entirely. They are unisexual. A single papaya tree is strictly male or strictly female.
But the most sophisticated outbreeding device occurs when a flower has both parts ready at the exact same time.
Yeah.
This is where we see chemical warfare at the microscopic level, a mechanism called self-incompatibility.
I really want to understand the mechanics of this, because it's one thing to say the plant rejects its own pollen, but how does it actually stop it?
You can think of the female pistil as a bouncer at an exclusive club, checking the ID of every pollen grain that lands. When a pollen grain hits the stigma, the female tissue reads the complex proteins coating the outside of the pollen. It is literally running a genetic background check.
No way.
Yeah. If it reads those proteins and recognizes its own exact DNA signature, if it identifies the pollen as self-felon, the bouncer steps in. The pistil actively cuts off hydration and nutrients to that specific pollen grain, effectively starving it so the pollen tube physically cannot grow. It demands an outsider, and it will kill its own pollen to ensure genetic diversity.
It literally starves the clone.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say a genetically diverse outsider pollen grain lands.
Yeah.
The bouncer checks the ID, it passes, and the chemical dialogue is a success. Female accepts it. The pollen tube breaks out of that tough shell, tunnels all the way down, guided by the siren song of the filiform apparatus we talked about, and reaches the embryo sac. We have reached the delivery room.
We have.
But earlier, you noted there are 2 male gametes riding in that tiny boat. Why 2? Mammals usually only need 1 sperm to fertilize an egg.
This is the defining evolutionary signature of flowering plants. It's called double fertilization. When the pollen tube hits those helper cells, it bursts open, releasing both male gametes. The first male gamete does exactly what you'd expect. It performs syngamy, it fuses directly with the female egg cell.
And since they're both haploid, meaning they each brought half the blueprints, they combine to make a diploid zygote, which has the full instruction manual.
Correct. That diploid zygote will divide and develop into the embryo, the actual baby plant. But we still have that second male gamete. Instead of fertilizing an egg, it travels to the very center of the embryo sac, where that massive central cell is waiting with its 2 polar nuclei, and the male gamete fuses with both of them simultaneously.
So you have 2 nuclei from the mother plus 1 from the father. That makes 3.
Exactly. This is known as triple fusion. The result is a highly unusual triploid cell, meaning it has 3 sets of genetic material. This cell rapidly divides to become a specialized tissue called the endosperm.
So, to put this in human terms, well, the entire process is essentially delivering a biological care package. The first male gamete makes the actual baby, and the second male gamete essentially packs its lunchbox.
That's a great analogy.
The endosperm is just this.
We did. To create high-yielding supercrops, scientists manipulate this exact chemical dialogue. They will take a flower bud and perform emasculation, physically snipping off the male stamens before they mature. Then, they cover the entire female flower with a protective bag to ensure no random, wind-blown pollen can land on it.
They just quarantine the female part.
Yes. They wait until the female stigma is perfectly receptive, remove the bag, and intentionally dust it with the specific, highly desirable pollen they have selected. By physically controlling the pollen-pistil interaction, humanity bypasses the wind, bypasses the insect gig economy, and dictates the double fertilization process to engineer the food that sustains our global population.
Man, so when we pull all of these complex threads together, the end result of this entire epic saga, the KCAG structural engineering, the adamantium spacesuits, the chemical landing beacons, the insect bribery, the ruthless female gamete selection, and the bizarre double fertilization, all of it results in a simple fruit and seed.
It's breathtaking when you map it out.
The lecture uses a really grounded example. If you take a simple chickpea, soak it overnight, and carefully peel back that thin outer seed coat, what you are looking at inside is exactly what we just described. You are looking at the tiny baby embryo resting next to its massive stored lunchbox, the cotyledons formed from that triploid endosperm.
You are literally holding the final, stabilized product of millions of years of evolutionary warfare and chemical engineering in the palm of your hand.
So you, listening right now, The next time you bite into an apple or you eat a piece of corn on the cob or you slice open a papaya and scrape out all those seeds, take a second to respect the absolute biological madness that went into making it. You are eating the results of cross-species bribery, microscopic armor, and legal chemical security checks, all sitting quietly right there on your plate.
It entirely changes how you view the natural world. And, well, to build on that, there's a thought worth considering that stems from all this.
Okay, what is it?
We spent this deep dive outlining how plants draft the wind, the ocean, and the animal kingdom, including us, as mere couriers to spread their gametes. We view ourselves as the masters of artificial hybridization, controlling our crops.
Right.
But what if we have the power dynamic backwards? By evolving to produce these incredibly sweet, energy-rich fruits and highly nutritious seeds, could it be that flowering plants actually domesticated us?
Oh, wow.
Have they simply manipulated humanity into clearing massive forests, irrigating deserts, and intentionally planting their genes across the entire surface of the Earth?
That is wild. They really aren't the simple kitchen sponges we thought they were. They might just be the ones running the whole show.
Something to chew on.